Before we begin, I wanted to give a huge shout out to the folks at Amazon Music for partnering with us on this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. But more on this later. Right then, let's get right into today's episode. I have a question for you. What is the proper opening race of the season? If you're somewhat of an old Formula One fan, like all of us on the Inside Line F1 podcast, you will truly answer the question with only one word, that is Melbourne. And that's it. We are back here for the Albert Park Grand Prix. Actually, the Melbourne Grand Prix or the Australian Grand Prix, I think they've changed the names a couple of times. But regardless, we are here at the Albert Park. And guess what, folks? Last year, 440,000 people made their way to watch Formula One Grand Prix here. That's how much the circuit is loved. And unanimously, I think we can agree upon the same thing, right, Kunal? This is the proper start of the year, which is why our first event, also for the Inside Line Club, is going to happen for Australia.
Yes, it is. It seems like the good old days. Australia, first race of the season. Australia, also the first race of the race screenings that we do in Mumbai, in India. This one's going to be at Car, at the social out there. I'm not going to be there physically. I'll try and attend virtually like I always do. But I know that Sawmill and F1 Stats Guru will definitely be there. But I also love the whole timing, that Sunday, it's a Sunday morning race and you're done with and you have the whole Sunday to you. Because guys, remember, this is actually not a Thursday, Friday, Saturday race weekend. For the first time in 2024, we actually have a Friday, Saturday, Sunday race weekend, the typical race weekend format.
Yeah, adjust your clocks and calendars now. Just when you're starting to get used to a Saturday race, suddenly it's time to snap back in and get used to Sunday. But more reasons to be excited. I think last year we did talk about this enough, but it was a home race for an Australian driver, Oscar Piastri. This time, we've got two of them. So incredible stuff. We've got Piastri and Ricciardo attending their home race, and there'll be tons and tons of support. But the big stories to watch for, 4 DRS zones, lots of chaos in the pecking order as well. I mean, we're still at that stage where we're learning a lot about where the teams and drivers actually still are, Sundaram, aren't we?
I'll actually go back to the point about home races, because interestingly we have a string of home races coming up. So I just had to pull out the schedule right now. So we have Australia, Japan, China, a first for Zhou Guanyu, and United States. Italy, if you want to actually consider Danny Rick a half, he is half Italian actually. Then you have Monaco, Canada, Spain. So a string of home races coming up. But coming back to the other point, yes, Australia is actually a very, very interesting circuit for me. And growing up, this was obviously the home race. The opening race of the season for me. And like you said, 4 DRS zones. This is where usually the championship starts. And Melbourne usually has a little bit of a case of being a very, tricky race or a chaotic race, because Albert Park has always had a minimum of 3 DNFs, always. Last year, we had 8 DNFs, if you remember. We had 3 red flags, the most ever seen in a single Grand Prix. So I really expect things to get really chaotic and interesting this weekend.
Wait, 8 DNFs and the biggest heartbreak of the entire season, Carlos Sainz with that penalty that the FIA gave him. And wait, on that subject as well, 2 things to mention. Firstly, it might just be a home race for another driver. We aren't quite mentioning him enough, but Valtteri Bottas is now technically 70% Aussie. So let's just put him in there with the mullet and all the accent stuff as well.
But he's 77% Aussie, sticking to his 70s.
Nicely done. Nicely done.
That daddy jokes late in the hour, in the day in Oslo time. You can never miss them, can you?
Well, that's a joke that in some circles would get you kicked. That didn't land. That didn't land. No,
but you said 440,000 people in Albert Park, Australia. Yeah. My goodness, that's incredible. A temporary race circuit. By the way, 440,000 is almost 80% of Oslo, the city where I live in. The whole population is, roughly 640, 650. Imagine 440 tuning up for a race in Melbourne. But there is always a different excitement about Australia. It's, Somil and Sundaram, for me, there's this whole thing about F1 wanting to race at iconic circuits. Don't go to some of these newer circuits. But when we think of iconic circuits, pretty much they're just the ones in Europe, right? But to me, Albert Park and Suzuka, I would say, are two iconic circuits outside of Europe. I still don't think any of the Middle Eastern circuits are iconic. Singapore is still very, very modern for me. So when I think of an iconic circuit outside of Europe, Albert Park is pretty much very high on the list. Maybe Suzuka is obviously higher.
I'm just wondering, right, how much time does it take for it to become iconic? Because we came to Melbourne for the first time, I suppose, in 96. Exactly.
So we had Adelaide as the season finale in 95. And the very next race was once again in Australia in 96, the season opener. And since then, Albert Park has hosted races, either the first, second, or third race, never lower than that.
Hey, wasn't it similar in 2021 as well, where we had Saudi Arabian Grand Prix as being the second last one, and then we had the race being second? But the point being here, 30 odd years it takes. One day, Bahrain will also be iconic. Until that day, let's just cherish Albert Park, Melbourne Park, I'm saying. But hey, one more thing to cherish over there this weekend. We're going to have a demo run with two big showcase cars, rather a car and a bike. It's going to be Mick Doohan riding alongside his son, who's going to be driving an old Benetton Formula One car. And for those of you who don't know, Mick Doohan, multiple-time MotoGP world champion, a legend of the sport, whose son currently is in Formula 2, eyeing an Alpine seat as well. So there's even more celebrations. And to add to that, we may or may not see Carlos Sainz back in that Ferrari, which for me is a big moment, because if he does come back, that for me is the biggest celebration more than anything else.
Before we actually go on, Somil, for somebody like you, who's the voice of MotoGP in India, who's literally the voice of the Inside Line F1 podcast, having done over 300 episodes, you should have been at the Albert Park circuits, because both your sports, MotoGP and Formula One, will actually have demonstration runs this weekend. I think it's going to be pretty fun to see that. And I'm pretty sure everyone, the minute they see the car, they're like, hear that engine go, right? And the Doohans, Mick is definitely very, very popular than Jack. Jack is reserve driver for Alpine. Probably not the best team to even be a reserve driver for. But exciting demonstrations, these things always bring newer audiences, newer attention. And the fact that I think one session they're both going to run together alongside each other, and that's going to be pretty iconic for everyone out there.
Yeah, exactly. There's going to be that. There's going to be 400,000 fans. There's going to be the battle of qualifying. Guys, I want to put this question to you, right? This is a really tricky one, because in the last couple of races, apart from the one constant being Max Verstappen winning, there's been another constant. Verstappen P1 in qualifying, Leclerc P2 in qualifying. The third person has always been different. And when I say always, it's probably not the heaviest word to use here, because we've only had two races so far. But we have had two different drivers qualifying in P3 in the last couple of races. The big question to you guys is, we know who's going to win this. Of course we do, unless there's some sort of chaos. Who qualifies third? That seems to be the one big thing full of volatility for me. Where's your money on, Sundaram?
It's a very difficult question, because, like you said, it's Red Bull and Ferrari up front. You'd expect Sergio Perez to be up there. You would expect him to be up there, unless his late 2023 form starts kicking in. But is Sainz going to be 100%? That's always going to be a question mark, because Albon really struggled a lot when he came back at the Singapore Grand Prix last year after a surgery, the similar surgery last year as well. So that's going to be very tricky. But I think I have my money on George Russell after the Red Bulls and the Ferraris.
I am actually going to put my money on Fernando Alonso. He has qualified that Aston Martin. Okay, he has qualified that Aston Martin out of position for those two races that we've had in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia. But the interesting thing here, you guys are, Samuel, you mentioned, will Carlos Sainz actually be back? We don't know. Let's wait till the official confirmation or the denial, etc. And then Sundaram pointing out that Albon was still struggling when he came back in Singapore. The interesting thing here is when Albon actually came back in Singapore, there was a 3-week gap between the races at that time, right? This time, there is just 2 weeks. Of course, we don't know the severity of how it was for both the drivers, etc. And that begs the question, could Oliver Behrman actually get a second shot at that Ferrari seat? And if he does, could he even be better prepared than he was in Saudi? Because Saudi, clearly we know what happened. And, Heinz Harald Frentzen, the famous former Formula One driver, actually replied to me on Twitter saying he's never driven these cars. But the fact that Oliver Behrman didn't make a single mistake, knowing that the whole world's eyes were on him and there was that pressure to perform, and he didn't make a single mistake. And that's what actually stood out for Frentzen when it came to Behrman. So could Behrman be in the car? And if he does, could he again, do what he did, get into Q3, which is what he missed the last time, and then go on and score some points?
That's a very interesting point, because I always felt that Liam Lawson had a very difficult debut last year at Zandvoort because it was raining. But probably being chucked into a Ferrari car, that too around a track like Jeddah, I think that's probably the most dangerous or the worst track to actually make your F1 debut, because it's got very low grip. It's the fastest street circuit out there, and you have a competitive car like a Ferrari. So that's probably the most difficult debut anyone could endure. The fact that he kept it well within the walls, he didn't crash, he didn't make any sort of mistakes like you mentioned, makes it a very good debut. And in that sense, he's probably going to be more prepared. I think he also had a couple of private tests at Fiorano between these two Grand Prix weekends. So if he's in that car, he's obviously going to be better prepared. And if we're going to have the first day race in 4 race weekends, guys, we forgot to mention that. It's going to be the first day race. I think he'll be well suited, well prepared to still go forward and impress. So yeah, I would really look forward to see if Ollie Behrman's back in the car this weekend.
I'm going to just add one more point. Mark Hughes, the famous Mark Hughes, also wrote to me on Twitter, and he said one of the differences, and I asked this question, are the cars very easy to drive? And Somil, if you remember, when we did the Saudi Arabian review, we actually asked this question. Are these cars easier to drive? That was one theory we put up. The second theory was, are drivers coming better prepared with the private testing that we know Oliver Behrman did in Fiorano, like Sundaram pointed out? And one of the things Mark Hughes turned around and said is, this era of Formula One is seeing drivers drive roughly 2 seconds off the optimal lap time, because they're all driving to tire stint life rather than a lap time, as opposed to how it was in the earlier years where you were just driving those super qualifying laps. As we've sort of seen Formula One also reliving on social media as well. So that's another give and take, but we'll never know. We just know that Oliver Behrman had a great debut, and that's what we're going to remember, even though pretty much nobody's going to keep asking this question apart from the three of us.
Drive for Tire Survival. Is that a good name for a documentary? Can we float it? No.
Sponsored by Pirelli?
Sponsored by Pirelli, indeed. But on that whole subject, right, a quick side note before we get down into the other more on-track stuff that you should be keeping an eye on for this weekend. I just want you guys to picture, what if you're Oliver Behrman right now? Where do you go? What do you do? Ferrari is clearly out of the question for at least the next couple of years. And even though the theories of, hey, Ferrari should let go of Lewis Hamilton because they've got Behrman on their hands, ostentatious is probably the kindest word that can be used for that. You just don't let go of Lewis Hamilton, right? It's not just about what he does in the car, which is anyway levels ahead. The marketing money is just beyond anything else that anyone else can pull off. So there's that. But what happens next? He has to do well in Formula 2, which is what Fred Vasseur has very clearly, openly come out and said, that he needs to do well in that championship. He said that, I know I've ruined it partially for him, but he's got to do well there. So that's one criteria. But conventional wisdom, if the teams really are looking at his talent and they really are appreciating, the ideal scenario, or at least the most logical one based on past experiences, would be Haas. What do you want to go to Haas? It's like such a weird position to be, right? Because in one side of things, you can be dreaming about a Formula One drive and thinking you're the next Oscar Piastri, thinking, hey, if I'm that good, do I really want to spend a few years at Haas? But it's not even tangible at the moment in time. It's such a hard place to be for the youngster, I'm thinking. So it's kind of a weird time for him to just get back in and focus on Formula 2 now, Sundaram. I find it to be quite a fun scenario for him.
That's the dilemma. Once you've actually tasted how these cars, how quick they can go, you really don't want to come back to Formula 2 and then continue with the rest of the campaign. You really want to be back in that F1 car and as soon as possible. So it's a good problem for him to have, and that too at the age of just 18 years. So it is very uncharacteristic of Ferrari to actually hand an 18-year-old a debut, but they didn't have any option last weekend. But it's going to be an interesting problem because there's no other place where he can go. He has to go to Haas, and probably the seat in Ferrari is locked in for the next 2 to 3 years as well. But I think Ferrari are not going to make the mistake that Alpine did with Oscar Piastri. They're going to make sure that he has a watertight contract. He doesn't slip through their fingers and go to any other team. He's going to be at Haas most likely next year because Haas has had, I think, scheduled 6 free practice sessions for Oli this year. So they're really trying to make sure that he comes into that team next year. And I think he's going to spend a year or two maybe there before he gets that Ferrari drive. I think it's going to be very difficult to see him elsewhere.
Wait, do we know the length of his Ferrari contract, Kunal? Is there anything out there about it? No, right?
No, it will almost never be known. And, he's a junior driver, which means these contracts pretty much go endless till saying if you achieve ABC, we'll get you into Formula One. And then even when we get you into Formula One, we will try and place you either on our team or a partner team, and you literally cannot leave. And if you want to leave, you got to pay us back some of the money or a lot of the money that we've spent on your career. That's pretty much how it happens, right? And
is that the case? How does that work in? Like from your time at Force India, what was that system like? I'm genuinely curious because I hadn't heard of this before. So Oscar, or rather McLaren, might have paid Oscar's contract off for Alpine, right? In that case?
That's the thing. In the case of Alpine, they relied on trust. They relied on, not a contract. They were hoping in the goodwill of Alpine having invested in Piastri's career, things would go through. So that's a bad example to take, right? Okay. But in the case of Pierre Gasly, in the case of Carlos Sainz, in the case of these two drivers who moved from Red Bull then to Renault, okay, there has to be a exchange of money. Now, it all depends how much Red Bull, in this case of, Gasly and Sainz, would ask for back in return. And it makes sense, right? Because if I'm using this as an example, let's assume you're a junior driver, Samuel, and I am spending millions of dollars trying to get you to Formula One. I am spending that money because I believe in your talent. More importantly, I believe in your future earning potential. It's your earning potential that I'm putting money on, not you scoring points, not you getting poles, right? That's, of course, what's visible. But what's not visible is how much money can Sawmill actually end up making. So I'm banking on what is known as future earning potential. Now, if that future earning potential is taken away from me, I'm saying I want the investment I made in your career back for me. Is that the principal amount? Is that a principal with an interest? It depends on case-to-case basis.
Interesting. I really didn't know that. That's interesting.
We just learned something.
Thank you, exactly. Indeed. Yeah, not bad. Some nuggets that you only get on the Inside Line F1 podcast. But should we get back to the on-track stuff now, guys? Because it's been...
Let's do that.
Let's do that, yeah?
Temporary race circuit. I always love these temporary ones. They're in the city, but not a street circuit. Why can't we just have more temporary race circuits?
Yeah, exactly. And at this temporary race circuit, it's very interesting to note that last year, Alex Albon did have a DNF, which was not very good, but he qualified 8th in a Williams. And remember, at that stage, Williams would just back off. Frankly, let's just say another terrible season in 2022. So it was quite a surprise to see Alex Albon in P8. This year, I am personally very excited to see where that car stacks up because James Vowles very clearly at the time of the launch said that we don't want this car to be a straight line merchant. I'm paraphrasing, but we want it to be a lot more balanced. Can we see something change in terms of the results? Will there be some shake-up on where Williams are? And by the way, Logan Sargent has also been somewhat closer to Alex Albon in terms of qualifying gaps and also where he's been in the race. Williams are going to be one interesting team to watch for, according to me.
I think so. And, you said who'll be P3. I'm going to actually spin that question further to say who will be in the top 10 in qualifying on Saturday. Because in Bahrain, typically we saw the top 5 teams score points. So it was, Ferrari, Red Bull, Aston Martin, McLaren, and did I miss someone? Mercedes, right? They scored points in the race. But in the Q3, we saw Nico Hülkenberg slip in at the expense of Lance Stroll, right? So we had one top 5 member. So one of the top 10 cars, the fastest cars, actually not make it to Q3. In Saudi Arabia, at the expense of Oliver Behrman, who we can, of course, pardon for not getting into Q3, Yuki Tsunoda made it into qualifying. Could it be, Alexander Albon in the Williams who could now again make sure that the Williams is back in the top 10 at the Albert Park circuit? So that's something I would really be looking to score. And expanding further on this, now that I already said that the top 5 teams scored in the race in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, Haas became the 6th team to score a point. Could we actually see a 7th team score points in 2024? And hence, could that be Williams? Although Alpine is going to wish that it is them if ever they score a point in 2024.
Something very interesting happened last year at last year's Australian Grand Prix because of all those DNFs that happened through the race. After the end of that round, all 10 teams had scored by then. So if we have more retirements this year, because we've had barely a few, we didn't see any in Bahrain, we saw just a couple in Saudi. If we have more retirements this weekend, then we can actually have more teams scoring points, and Williams could be one of them.
And as you rightly mentioned, Albert Park is the home of chaos anyway. We see so many safety cars happen here every single time, which spins us back onto another fun point to watch for in the race, the opening lap. Every single time you do think of Albert Park, you think of such a chaotic opening lap. 2019, Ricciardo losing his front wing. I think it was 2004 when Ralf Schumacher flew off the top as well. I think we saw a couple of really crazy ones. I think last year it was one of the Haas's who cut a corner or something, right? It was some sort of chaos there in the last couple of years where one car cut a corner, there was a big accident in the middle as well, or a couple of cars getting pushed off to that right outside wall heading out of turn number 1. That's also going to be crazy. That first couple of laps are going to be, those first couple of laps are going to be quite fun. But generally as well, I know we're deep into this episode, but we haven't mentioned this yet. It's not the old Melbourne, which means the slow speed corners that we really like about it. I wouldn't say passing opportunities because they really weren't, but the corners that gave it character are sort of gone now, which means 4 DRS zones, lots and lots of straights, corners where you just sort of fly past and make it a kink rather than actually slowing down, turning and making it more technical. And good for Lance Stroll, that one corner where he actually crashed in his first year is also gone. The one where he just turned right onto the lakeside, which is incredible for him as well. But do you guys like the layout now? I mean, we've had 1 year to see it, and after the race last year, there was so much chaos that we didn't get to talk a lot about it. But what do you guys make of it? Is it, judging by the tone of my voice, I'm clearly not a fan. But what about you guys? What do you think of it, Kunal?
Oh, I'm definitely not a fan. I think, if I remember correctly, it's turns 9 and 10 that they've sort of reprofiled. And that's actually taken some of the character away, because one of the beauties of Albert Park that I know is you could get really up and close to the walls. Turn 10 exit, you could kiss the wall. The closer you get, the faster you can sort of be. Yeah. And they've just taken that whole, away. And I love the corners that follow after that, the high speed, chicane that comes. But there was a lot of character to this as well. And I just don't think we always need DRS zones, and we don't always need, high speed sections. Some of these Mickey Mouse stuff, as we call it, although turns 9 and 10 were hardly any Mickey Mouse stuff. But if you got that wrong, technically, you were under attack for that, high speed sequence of corners that were to come. So, unfortunate that they've reprofiled it, but we just got to live with it. And you mentioned opening lap. I love the opening lap here, because the opening 2 or opening 4 sequence of corners are turns 1 and 2 are turn right and left, and then again 3 and 4 turn right and left, and then there's another slow speed left-hander. So what it does is it keeps the whole pile bunched up, and that's why we see lots of action, sometimes even lots of retirements, lots of accidents, spins, etc. on the opening lap. And truth be told, the way Formula 1, Formula 1.5 and Formula 1.75 are racing in 2024, it's the opening lap and maybe the second lap where we could see some action before everyone settles down in the other's wake, gives a 2-second gap, waits for the DRS to be activated, and so on. So that's why I'm really excited about that opening lap this Sunday.
No, for me, I think it's quite the opposite, because like you said, the opening lap is very crucial. I think the opening sector is very crucial. And after the first sequence of corners, like you said, there is a right hander, there's a slow left hander. That's where a lot of the chaos could actually happen before everyone's actually then let loose towards the high speed sections. And probably you might not see a lot of overtakes after that. But the thing is, that section of turn 9 and 10 was probably the limiting factor as to why we didn't have a lot of overtakes over the last couple of seasons. And that's why they had to go ahead and make that move. Last year, we had 30 overtakes, and that's the most that we've ever seen at Albert Park in the hybrid era. And that whole high speed section was probably one of the reasons why that was possible. Otherwise, people are always going to complain that just like Spain, just like Barcelona, we don't see enough overtakes and the race is very processional. But if that allows for more overtaking, if that allows for more battles, I would love to see that happen. And I think we did see that to some extent last year. But I think the pit lane here is also much more narrower than in other circuits because, like I said, it's a temporary circuit. So I think I have to probably recheck this. I think the pit lane speed also drops considerable by a considerable number here, which also means strategy could be very important. I know it's a one stopper. It's a typical one stopper from mediums to hards, but then strategy could be crucial over here.
That's a great point. Actually, the pit lane speed limit here used to be 60 kilometers per hour for the reasons you mentioned. They upped it a couple of years ago to 80 kilometers per hour, and for the very reason. So, I would have loved for it to go back to 60 because it just brings an additional strategy element. Although, a slower pit lane speed limit means you're anyway taking away the option of drivers and teams pitting more than once, so to say. But strategy-wise, it's not going to be the most exciting race, as you just pointed out, unless there are stoppages, red flags, safety cars, and so on. But let's see that there is somebody. Let's hope that there is somebody who challenges Max Verstappen, because he could be going for his 35th pole position, 3 poles in a row that he could be scoring, Bahrain, Saudi, and Australia. Could be going for his 57th win, his second 10 race winning streak. He could equal that. Now the question is, could he actually build that to 20 in 2024 given how he's going? Yeah. But why don't we just spend a few minutes, because while we are understanding all the stats and how it's all playing out, and for the new fans, especially the ones who are a bit on the fence, why don't you spend 5 minutes to just understand, is it really easy for Max to do what he's doing, or is he actually being challenged? What do you guys think? Somil, why don't we start with you?
I think he's only being challenged by himself and the limits that he has in terms of his performance. Clearly, that car is miles away. The challenge when you're that good is not to go that much faster. It's to go that much faster within the constraints of managing DNFs or technical failures, which is what they're doing right now. In Saudi Arabia, if you really look at the way he was driving, and also that crucial radio message at the end, he didn't say, his engineer, GP, didn't say, "Oh, well driven," or "You were extremely fast." He said, "Well managed." What does that mean? What does that tell you? At that level, when you're that good, it becomes all about managing your pace to the point where it's just able to win comfortably enough, but not push the car to the point where it could break or just end up saving an engine part, because you just also want to make sure that you end up taking 4 engines for the entire season. That's where the next level of greatness for Max lies, which is what it is. Easy? Definitely not. But the competition is internal more than external. So that's how I look at it, to be honest.
No, for me, I think it's the fact that a lot of people think it's all about a game of pace, but it's also a game of being consistent. And that's where I think Hamilton won me over during 2015, 16, 17, 18. He was so bloody consistent with that car, because the car gives you a certain platform and you as a driver kind of just push it even further. But it's very, very difficult to do that consistently week in, week out through all the sessions, acing all those corners, ensuring that you don't make a single mistake. Verstappen's not made a single mistake in a very long time. And that's something that's very admirable. And sure, he's not being challenged. The performance gap is such that he's not being challenged by any other team. But if that does come to happen at some point of time, I think he will edge out the others. But he's in a very comfortable position at this point, I would say. The car gives him certain benefits. He's using it perfectly.
And I'll just add one layer here. And it's while it's Verstappen, it's also Red Bull Racing.
Yep.
They're able to hit their simulation tools so well that they come at any race circuit. And trust me, all these race circuits have different requirements from your package. They're able to hit the setup. They know exactly what their tires are going to be, stint life that we mentioned at the start of the episode. They're nailing their pit stops. I mean, despite all the performance advantage they have, Red Bull is still one of the fastest teams in pit stops. They're nailing strategy. They're nailing their opening laps, their starts. There are so many things that can go wrong,
Yep.
but they are able to nail all of that. And that to me is also one of the key highlights of this dominance that Max is showing. Consistency, error-free performance from the team and the driver. And trust me, they still push. On that Saturday, they are still challenged. And it's not that Max is qualifying 15th or 10th or 5th and then saying, I'm going to just use my race pace. No, he is still going for the first couple of rows as he can. Because again, one of those circuits where 4 out of the last 12 races have been won from pole. But importantly, 8 out of the last 12 races have been won from the front row. So qualifying is still as important. And qualifying in these cars is still very much on the limit. And they are still being challenged in qualifying. Although somebody listening in here could say, guys, in Bahrain, he was 2 tenths ahead. In Saudi, he was 3 tenths ahead. There's a very good chance if this trend continues, he's 4 tenths ahead in Australia. So he's technically not being challenged, in qualifying. At least somebody could argue that. But, he still has to be there every single lap, whether it's practice, qualifying, or the race. And he is there.
And what's the only way to beat a team that's that good? You can't have someone else beat them. They have to kill themselves internally.
Ooh.
That's what happens.
Ooh.
They kill each other. They don't have anyone good enough to come and beat them. It's all internal, which is what we're also getting to see. Because the latest developments are that the female employee. And one second, I'll just talk about the latest development in a second. I read somewhere, I can't even trust the validity of these stupid clickbait websites, but I read somewhere that apparently Jos Verstappen is getting personal with Christian Horner about this whole affair because the female employee was apparently speaking to Jos Verstappen himself. Like, what the hell, dude? Like, where are we these days with reporting? I like this, but the latest developments are that the so-called female employee is now taking the matter to the FIA, which means more escalation. It's a relatively minor thing, but all the rumors said that before Australia, Christian Horner would be dismissed. At the time of recording, he's there. Who knows? By the time this episode goes out, we might have a new team principal.
No. One sec. Yes, I know you're just... Firstly, we can't be clickbait because this is RTO. But why don't we actually see the trend? In Bahrain, it was Christian Horner under attack because it was the opening race of the season in the whole Red Bull scenario of things. In Saudi Arabia, it was Helmut Marko under attack, right? And Max Verstappen did not come in support of Horner. He spoke of performance, but he came out and he spoke in support of Marko, saying if Marko goes, I'm going because I know what Marco's done. And Marco's, of course, said this on our podcast last year in June, the only podcast he's ever been on for 1 whole hour, where he explained how he and Dietrich started Red Bull Racing and the Red Bull Junior program several years ago in the 70s and 80s and the likes, right? But my point here is, in Australia, who will come under attack? Which way will this Red Bull power struggle go? Because Jos Verstappen, who was rallying himself on the weekend of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, wasn't there in the paddock. But he will be, or he should be back, I assume, in Australia. Will there be more comments? Because I don't know which way the whole power struggle is going to go. The reverse could also be true, that Red Bull finally have had time between the races to sit down and say, guys, you know what? Actually, we built an even stronger car without those side parts that everyone was worried of. Can we find truce here? Can we just agree on how we're going to, move forward here? Because they want to continue. It seems crazy that Max is going to leave. Nobody would want to leave this dominant a car and go. So they're going to try and do everything to make it work rather than not make it work. So let's see how the whole Red Bull thing goes. But could very well be that the biggest headlines this weekend come from Daddy Jos the boss.
Exactly that. No competition at the top. What do we say? But last couple of points. Things to watch for in this race. Watch for how McLaren are going to be. I think Sundaram, it's going to be fun, right? Because in Saudi Arabia, we saw that McLaren was struggling to get past the Mercedes because they had no straight line speed. But the big question up in the air is it a car characteristic thing? Is it a setup thing? I think in Australia, we should get more of an answer towards that, which means the volatility in the midfield will be fun to watch. And then Mercedes are also such a big question mark, aren't they? I mean, we haven't been able to decipher where they really are. I don't think they know themselves, do they?
I think that's a very interesting battle in itself. McLaren, Mercedes, sometimes the Aston Martin's also there. But McLaren have had this problem last year as well. They've really had a draggy car, and that also came to the fore this time. And Saudi does have some very long straights, and the effect of DRS is quite big over there. So it was expected, but I think they did quite well, finishing in the top 10. And each race is probably going to give us more answers to that. From what it seems that they're not going to be coming up with big upgrades until the first 6-7 races of the season, so there's not going to be much of a difference. But I believe McLaren did pretty well around high speed circuits last year, Silverstone and the likes. So if they finish in the points last weekend, they could still have a decent outing this time out. I'm actually very curious to see where Mercedes is this weekend, because it's going to probably end one of my very interesting stats, because Mercedes has always been on the podium in Australia in the hybrid era, and they don't seem to have the car to put them on the podium once again. They've had a bunch of other issues cropping up. And going back to the point which Kunal mentioned as well, teams, Red Bull has been so inch perfect, even everyone in the paddock. Teams like Mercedes have been having cooling issues in Bahrain. Ferrari had brake issues in Bahrain. So, despite all the manpower and all the money that goes in, they do tend to make these little mistakes. Mercedes adopting a new aero philosophy, they're still learning, but it's going to be interesting to see how well they adapt and how quickly they learn, because they've not been able to match what they see in the simulator and what they've actually been seeing on track. So it's back to square one and trying to understand the car for them once again.
And you spoke very interestingly of updates, Sundaram. And one of the things is typically teams would not bring upgrades to a flyaway race because it's expensive. You have to, bring them in via air freight and so on. But now we've got, Australia, Japan, China, all of them flyaway races. So will teams actually bring upgrades, or will they stay away from them? But upgrades is not the only way to extract performance. Like Ferrari keeps saying, we just need to extract more from our package. We need to just hit the setup windows much better. Teams would have had 2 races and then a 2-week gap to the third race. I expect that they would have had more time to try and find performance in their existing packages in itself. So that's something I'm looking forward to. Will the pecking order change? Because why don't we just actually see the pecking order is Max Verstappen, right? Then Checo Perez. There's a bit of a gap. I'm talking of the race. Then there's Ferrari. So that's pretty much set in the top 3, right? Then there is either Aston Martin, McLaren, or Mercedes, or McLaren, Aston Martin, Mercedes, depending on how you see it. But a lot of that is just track position built. It's down to, if you have track position, you will more or less be ahead of your competition. And it's also down to this whole thing about, the inability to follow is coming back, given how these regulations are now in the third year, and the teams have sort of developed their aero platforms a lot more. In fact, James Allison, and we could probably do this another day because we are also getting close to the 40-minute mark, but James Allison just a couple of days ago said that FIA was wrong in chasing dirty air and reducing it. And he was, of course, saying this in reference to the fact that, teams are going back to seeing that it's difficult to follow cars, right? But that's pretty much your top 5 that you got. And then somewhere around is either the Racing Bulls or the Williams. And then towards the bottom of all of this, I think comes Kick Sauber or whatever you call them and so on. So that's the pecking order. Will a new circuit, will this gap, will when I say new, as in terms of characteristics, change this pecking order? And that's what we'll know from Australia.
Yep, so many fun things to watch. Now that we're looking ahead in the future, let's end this episode with a look back in the past. Guys, one memory each from Melbourne. We mentioned that it's the home of Formula One for all of us. Where do we begin with this one? I am going to go for a really goofy memory because it's all fun and games to say, hey, Sebastian Vettel won here or Kimi Raikkonen did. I remember the time in 2011 when Adrian Sutil actually opened up the DRS at a corner. Remember, first year ever of the DRS's application. At that time, you couldn't quite, it wasn't quite as efficient as the modern day systems that you could just brake and it'll just shut down. And then Sutil heading into a corner, press the DRS button. Kunal, you'll be able to expand more on it because you were there in the team at that point in time and then spun it round. And everyone at that point, at least looking from the outside, was confused about what's happened here. Has he put in too much throttle? What's happened here? Turns out it was the stupid, devilish wing. And we still have a problem with it today.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're talking of. It was last corner, and again, it's a beautiful S that you come out of a left, right, and the right corner starts with the main straight, and it's the shortest main straight, goes up and comes down, and then you just flick the DRS wing open, and he opened that DRS wing a little too soon, lost all that rear end downforce, slammed it in, spun around, blah blah blah, and that's what happened. It was one of those things. And I also believe, no, this was just before he had a break here with his whole incident in China with Lewis Hamilton. But very interesting, goofy memory. But yeah, it just brings back a lot of thoughts. Now, you also mentioned, Somil, Ralph Schumacher's taking off, and I used to always believe Formula One cars are aeroplanes built inward, so they'll never take off. They'll just stay on the ground. And then here you see Ralph Schumacher showing off. And then you mentioned Kimi Raikkonen. Kimi Raikkonen won here for Lotus in 2013, if I remember correctly. And 2014, Kevin Magnussen, the best debut ever for any driver, on the podium with McLaren, that baby-faced Danish guy. I now love seeing him on the screen just because of how he treats his daughter Laura. It's a wonderful way to bring her up with this whole motorsport thing.
But Sundaram, what about you? What's your favorite Australian GP memory? What's the one that comes to your mind?
It's difficult to call it favorite, by the way. But before that, Kunal mentioned Kimi Raikkonen winning in 2013 around Albert Park. That's actually the last time a team apart from Ferrari, Mercedes, or Red Bull won around a street circuit or a temporary circuit. So it's been 11 years since we've seen a different team apart from the top three win at a street venue. Not my favorite memory, but the fact is that I'm grateful Fernando Alonso is still racing, still performing at the highest levels. And Melbourne does take me back to 2016 when he rammed into Esteban Gutierrez, flipped over, did a couple of somersaults, and still managed to come out unscathed, and still continues to contribute to Formula One and delights all of us. So 2016 Australia, a very horrific crash, but good to see that he's still performing at the highest level.
And what a rough couple of years it must have been, huh? 2015, that first accident where he forgot a lot.
Oh, he was.
And oh, hey, that's the start of a new Fernando. Hey, that's where the rookie driver actually started to come in. Interesting.
I was thinking about this yesterday. That's when it all started. That's when his rebirth happened.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, you're right. Because I remember 2014 is getting all tired and stuff. We have nailed it. But okay, prediction times. Time. Where do you think Alonso finishes? Let's not go for the conventional ones because I don't need to guess who's P1. P2, let's not go for an order bit. Let's go for more specific questions. Sergio Perez, do you think he'll be second? Yes or no? In a word, I think he will be.
No.
Who will be second then?
Leclerc.
Okay. Who is the last car to qualify in the top 10, apart from the usual suspects? I say Alex Albon.
Yuki Tsunoda.
Not bad. Oh wait, we could have said Lance Stroll as well. That would have been an unusual suspect too, in a way, technically. Yeah, bit of a harsh one. And final prediction question: will Carlos Sainz be on the podium? I am just satisfying my ego by saying this. Will he be? I'm just going to say yes.
Okay, I'll say yes as well.
Bias, quite clearly. And we shall see what the results are going to be like at the end. But folks, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. We'll be back with more, including the Australian GP race review. And yes, if you are in Mumbai, I will genuinely be annoyed if you don't come to watch the race with us, because if you're at that stage of the episode, clearly it means that you love listening to us, and we would absolutely love the opportunity to discuss the race with you after it ends as well. So join us at Car Social, and the link to the tickets will be live on our social media in a couple of days' time. So keep tracking over there. Take care, folks. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast. Before we ended, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Amazon Music once again for partnering with us on this episode of the podcast.